I'd like to welcome you to this important and informative series brought to you by the University of Southern Queensland's Northern Australian Climate Program, the University of Queensland, and in collaboration with the Southern Queensland Northern New South Wales Innovation Hub. The NACP program is funded by Meat and Livestock Australia and the Drought and Climate Adaptation Program. Over the next 3 weeks and at the field days, we're going to delve into this complex topic that is livestock thermal stress and what it means for the health and welfare and productivity of your stock and how it can likely impact your business. Due to time limits, we won't be responding to questions live today. You'll find that as the series progresses, that the questions that you have will more than likely be answered. More complex questions will be taken to the Q&A panel session at the field days for robust discussion. You will receive an invitation to register to attend the field days, so please keep an eye out for it in your emails, and you will also receive an email of the webinar recordings. I encourage you at the end of today's session to please answer the poll questions, the survey questions. Not only does this help us to better understand and address from a research perspective the impacts of livestock thermal stress is having on production systems, it also allows us to demonstrate the value of the learning series like this to project funding partners. Whether you're a cattle or a sheep producer, I am certain as a fellow grazier, you will find this series highly informative with practical strategies for managing thermal stress in your livestock production system. In today's webinar, we're going to look at better understanding livestock thermal stress and what drives it, what conditions increases the risk of both heat stress and chill hypothermia in our grazing enterprises across Northern Australia, and where to source the forecast information and tools. To kick things off, I'd like to now hand over to Dr. Angela Lees and Professor John Goggin.
So I guess the first thing to just to start off setting the scene a little bit is that we do have a lot of issues around the unpredictable climates that we deal with. I'm mainly going to focus on beef, but we'll have some sheep stuff in here as well. So we know what the challenges are. We have a lot of climate variability. We have extreme events, and these lead to negative impacts on production. But it's also important that we think about, when we think about stressors, that usually it's multiple things that are happening all at once. It's not just one single stressor that has that impact on the animals that we're dealing with. And so we shouldn't really look at these in isolation. We can also need to think about, when we talk about thermal stress, whether it's heat or cold, that we have what we call chronic thermal stress and acute thermal stress. And chronic is really just that normal day-to-day exposure animals would have to a normal summer or normal winter conditions. They have some negative impact on production possibly, and it really comes down to the type of animals that we're running, whether they're susceptible or not to those more chronic conditions. The ones that really sort of jump up and grab us are these acute thermal stresses, and this is where we have these sudden increases in ambient conditions, so increase in temperature, increase in humidity, or it could be cold spells coming through. These can be short-term, only a couple of days, or they may go out for a week. And one of the things we do know with these, that we're seeing more of these events really over the last 15 years or so. So it's becoming, these acute thermal stresses events are becoming more typical. And typically, we are concerned more with the acute events. These are the ones that are really hard for us to manage. We usually don't have a lot of lead-in time that they're coming. Sometimes we do, but usually not. But these are the ones that really cause us, I guess, the most grief in terms of losses in animals and production losses. So just a couple of things to think about also. One of the things Angela, I wanted to talk about in this session was the impact that thermal stress has on lifetime performance, and Angela will come back to that in a later webinar as well. The important thing for us to keep in mind is that animals need to be able to balance and be adaptable to whatever the stresses are out there in their environment. This is a really critical process, particularly from a reproduction perspective and a developmental production perspective, because we know that these stresses can have significant influences on embryonic development. And these can either be, in some cases, they can actually have a positive impact on the embryo and the embryonic development, but quite often they have negative responses. And these are the areas that we're trying to really understand as we're moving forward in this area. So we know that they have lifelong and heritable effects on an organism's physiology and behavior. We don't fully understand this in terms of how we manage it at this point in time, but we do know it has long-term effects. And as I said, Ange will talk more about that in a later webinar. Lots of things happen. So if we look at this diagram here, so we've got a cow standing there. She's being exposed to heat, and we know that there's direct and indirect effects that are happening. And we just look at the direct effects initially, and I'll come back to a couple of these points as we go through. We know that a cow that's heat stressed, even if she's a tolerant animal, there's still going to be some compromising of the uterine environment because of the heat that animals has absorbed. We know it has impacts on hormones. It leads to poor estrus expression, low fertilization rates, poor embryo quality, and embryonic loss. Now, this is pretty well known what's going on down at that end. If there's also a negative energy balance because there's poor nutrition, then the effects can be exacerbated. So again, it's looking at not necessarily just a single effect. What's going on here is part of the cow's adaptation to dealing with heat, and some of this has to do with changes in blood flow to the uterine environment as blood moves from the internal parts of the animal to the peripheries so that she can dissipate heat back out to the environment. So even Brahman cows will be compromised to an extent in this area, and in some cases, we put down things like poor fertility due to maybe nutrition, when it could well also be due to just the environment that they're in with heat and the timing of the pregnancy and so on. There's not a lot of information on how Bos indicus animals respond to these sort of environmental stressors, particularly with heat, because as I said, we just assume that they're heat tolerant, so we don't worry too much about it. But we do know from studies that we can see things like embryonic death, abortion, prolonged anestrus, reductions in conception rate, and then these impacts can last for considerable amounts of time. We're not talking days, we're talking weeks and months. So we know these things happen. The problem we have with a lot of extensive grazing situations is that it's hard to quantify it because we don't have the animals there every day to know that they've been affected. There's a fair bit on this slide, and I'm just going to sort of again briefly go through this because we will come back to some of this later on. But things we do know is that DNA can be affected, and as I said previously, they can have lifetime impacts and multi-generational impacts on the animals. We've got sufficient evidence now to show with both sheep and cattle that birth weight is lower in animals that have been from ewes or cows that have been affected by heat stress through gestation, and that has impacts on lifetime performance. And there's a recent study that's come out of South Africa looking at merino sheep. It has highlighted some of this quite well. We know we get shorter gestation lengths. There's impaired fertility, both in the males and females. We know we get impaired immune system, so the more susceptibility to disease. And the South African work has shown that there's a big impact on survivability of lambs that have been subjected to heat stress in utero. The heat stress effects in utero depend on whether it's early gestation or later gestation. Early gestation has impacts on basically developmental components of the animal, so the skeletal nervous system and those sort of things. And later gestation has a big impact on growth rate of those animals. the previous slide where I had the cow there, we can see that heat is transferred to the fetus, so the fetus actually warms up during these heat events, and this is a reduction of blood flow to the uterus and placenta, which makes that effect even more difficult for the animals to deal with. So the developing animal is very much so negatively impacted by a heat event, even though the cow or the ewe may not be as affected. There's evidence from bulls as well of longer term damage to the DNA. When talk about permanent damage to DNA, the animals look perfectly normal. The sperm looks normal. Pregnancies may occur, but the embryos are not viable or they're weak. And there's been some studies done, but not a lot around this, and even within heat tolerant breeds, you can see this. I think these are drought masters, that one bull's hardly affected at all by heat, another bull is adversely affected, which is the red line going through there. So he took a hit in early December or mid-December and really didn't get back up to normal in terms of sperm quality or morphology until April. So a long time impact on those animals, and things like transport can also make these situations worse. There's also behavioural changes that happen, and got a quote here from a grazier in North Queensland a couple of years ago that made the comment that animals born after 6 a.m. in the morning during summer will probably die, or at least be adversely affected, and it didn't really matter what breed type they had in that area. And we know from a lot of work that's been done elsewhere that as cows change their grazing times, then it also has an impact on calving time. So the more they eat at night, the more we'll see a change in calving time during the day. And the final thing just here is also on heat stress in calves. And again, we know a fair bit about what's going on there in terms of production losses on those animals, at least in the short term. We don't really understand the lifetime implications of some of these changes. Kieran McCosker will talk more about calves also in a later session, but it's an area we need to understand a lot more in, because we could be setting animals up for reduced performance by doing things or not doing things early on in the animal's development. And at that point, I can hand over to you, Ange.
Thanks, John. So I guess one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was around how some of the climate drivers might be influencing what's going on from a thermal stress perspective. And I think that we can all appreciate that we have a good comprehension of ambient temperature. So, when you're watching the weather report in the morning, you get told, it's going to be 32 degrees today, or it's going to be 45. And we've got a really good handle on that, 45 is a lot warmer than what 32 degrees is. But when it comes to sort of understanding how our thermal environment and the climatic drivers are influencing how ourselves and livestock are feeling that thermal stress, the other drivers are really important. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the role of humidity and how that humidity can change the threshold. So John, I'll just get you to pop forward a slide for me. And I do apologize in advance about my voice. I've gone down with laryngitis, so we're just trying to work our way through it today. So I think that we all have that appreciation that, we have an understanding that humidity can make our environment feel hotter. If you've ever gone from, I guess, Brisbane to Cairns through the summer, you step off that plane in Cairns and you go, oh God, I feel like I'm breathing in my water. I'd rather drink it than breathe it. So that humidity that we're talking about, we tend to sort of associate it with the amount of moisture that is in the air, and that, is kind of effectively what it is. But what happens when that moisture in the air goes up is that how we are feeling what ambient or air temperature is doing, it makes it hotter. So there's an interaction there that happens as well. So as air temperature and air pressure changes, the humidity or the water vapor content of that air can change as well. And so the reason why that has an impact, I think we can go to the next slide here too. Thanks, John. Did that go? John, can you move it forward a slide, please?
It moved on my screen.
Ah, there it is. Thank you.
Yep.
So the reason why that happens is that that humidity is the difference between what we feel as dry heat and wet heat. So when we talk about, I guess, the vastness of our pastoral systems, we have this really big diversity between hot and dry climates and hot and humid environments. And the humidity does make that environment feel hotter, and how we interact with that humidity drives some of these thresholds that we have. So this is a very, this image on the slide here is a very classical image that we see. It's typically something that we use for the dairy industry, but it shows quite nicely that interaction that's happening between ambient temperature down the x-axis of that image and humidity across the top. So what happens is that as the environment gets more humid, our threshold to cope with the thermal environment reduces, and that's very nicely shown in that slide by the change in the green, yellow through to red thresholds. Next slide, please, John. So the reason why we spend a little bit of time talking about this and we put an emphasis on humidity in particular is that when it comes to the interaction of ourselves and animals to that environment, that humidity really drives our capacity to offload and get rid of heat from our body. To a point where for most mammals, so cattle are a part of this as well, it's about 80% of that heat dissipation comes from what we call evaporative pathways. The way in which we generally do this for most species, and again, ourselves are included in this, is that first we sweat. And you would see it yourself if you get outside and you're a marathon runner or something and you're running in a humid environment, the sweat will bead up on your arms. Interestingly enough, too, cattle are actually a primary sweater. So they actually sweat first and then they'll start to change the respiratory dynamics afterwards. But they can also evoke some behavioral patterns in that as well around wetting the skin. So we've all seen those classical images of cows standing in dams or water troughs and things like that. So part of that is about evoking this heat dissipation through those evaporative pathways. And what happens is that when our ambient temperature specifically gets really close to body temperature, so sort of in that 36, 37 degree window, that evaporation loss is really the only way that we can actually lose heat from our body. And so I've put a little metric there around 85% of our total heat loss happens at 32 degrees. It's 85%. So it means that this evaporative pathway is really, really important for us. And so when our air becomes saturated with moisture or water vapor, the effectiveness of that pathway gets reduced. And so it means that we're not able to get as much moisture out of the respiratory surfaces or off the surface of the body, and that heat gets trapped inside the body and we can't get rid of it away from us as quick as what we would like to. So we tend to retain a little bit more of that heat. So that humidity is really important. So often when we talk about heat stress and thermal stress in particular, we don't necessarily want to worry about ambient temperature so much because it is important, but we sort of have a look at those humidity thresholds to have a better understanding of how reduced this evaporative pathway is going to be. And I think that that's all I wanted to cover on that, John. I think the next slide might be yours. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Ange. So just to follow on from what Ange was talking about in terms of these heat exchange mechanisms, one of the things, again, to keep in mind with this, that there's a lot of interactions between these different mechanisms. And again, just it's not one single thing that's operating. And they can be impacted by a whole range of different components. So I'm going to talk about radiation, solar radiation, and wind at the moment. And again, just as a diagram to see what's happening in an animal. We have this cow lying here on the ground. She's got evaporative heat loss, as Andrew's talking about, going out. She's got solar radiation coming in. She radiates energy back out to the environment. There's heat coming up off the ground, so reflective off the ground surfaces. She's lying on the ground, so there'll be some conductive heat loss into the ground if the ground's cooler than she is. She'll lose heat to the ground. If the ground's hotter than she is, she'll absorb heat. There's this convective heat loss from airflow, evaporative heat loss, as Andrew's talking about. And then there's the underlying just component of the animal in terms of its metabolic heat that it's producing. So when we talk about or think about wind speed, and again, think about yourselves that, if you're under a fan, you feel a lot cooler than you do not being under a fan on hot days, because you're getting that evaporative cooling happening off the surface of your skin. So usually we talk about in summer, it's usually a good thing, but it's not always a good thing in winter, because the animals can lose considerable amount of heat from the body because of this airflow over the animal's surface. So one of the things we do see in summer is animals will stand more to try to get more airflow around the body to dissipate heat. And in colder climates, they may spend more time lying down to sort of huddle up a bit more around to keep the body from dissipating heat. But the cooling effect is largely influenced by the wetness of the skin. So is the animal sweating? And also the type of fur and even type of skin those animals have. So this little diagram on the right here is just showing that as you increase airflow over an animal, increase the speed of wind over an animal, you start to see an increase in cooling on those animals, but it's also largely affected by how wet those animals actually are. The cooling effect is influenced by airspeed, and typically the greater the airspeed, the greater the cooling effect. But, and there's often buts in these things, unless the air is hot. So if you've got an air temperature that's, say, around 42 degrees and you've got a wind blowing on those animals, then the cooling effect is greatly reduced, and they may actually start to absorb heat from that hot air that's moving through. The cooling effect is also influenced by ambient temperature. Again, as most people would know, and Ange mentioned, the temperature, normal body temperature, and to get closer to ambient temperature, you start to lose that impact. So if you've got a cow that's at 38.6 degrees, the air temperature is 40, then she's not going to be dissipating heat back out to the environment. She'll be absorbing heat into her body, and then she'll have to go through different things to try to reduce it. It's also important to keep in mind that wind speed is highly variable through the day. It's very site specific. It's difficult to predict what wind's going to be doing. A bit of a messy diagram here on the right, but the pink line below is mean wind speed across a day, and the blue or purple line on the top, the blue line on top, is heat loss from an animal. So on the right-hand side, you see there's some negative numbers, and on the left-hand side is actually the airspeed that's moving over those animals. Excuse me. And you can see again on the right-hand side here, as you get down towards the bottom, that even though wind speed's high, the animals are actually not losing as much heat, because the air temperature and the air temperature has gotten closer to body temperature of the animal, so heat dissipation is being reduced, and also the animals are not sweating as much, and so they're not losing as much heat. There are multiple heat loss mechanisms that come into play at any one time. So we've got, and I'm not really going to talk too much about conduction, but these Angus steers here in a feedlot standing in mud. It's a major heat loss from those animals for a number of reasons. One, that they've lost their insulation. So if insulation cover goes on those animals in the wintertime, then they're going to lose a lot of heat. They're not going to be able to maintain body condition. Of course, in summer, that could be a positive impact, not standing in the mud, but having some loss of insulation. The situation can be made worse if we now have high wind speed, because it rapidly increases heat loss, and it's going to be made worse again if we've got animals that are in poor condition or are young, and particularly newborn and weaners. So again, because they're under a lot more stress, so these other stresses impact on what's happening. Coat colour is important. I guess there's a number of different trains of thought on this around how important actually is it. But we do know that, and we've measured this on Angus steers, getting a body surface temperature on the steers around 60 degrees Celsius. That's pretty hot. So, you've got an animal standing out in the sun with that sort of heat load on it. But we do know that as we move through from white-coloured, light-coloured animals to darker-coloured animals, that their ability to absorb heat from the solar load that's around them is much greater. So it's pretty well documented that that's going to be the case. There's other things that happen though around it in terms of the hair type on the animals and breed effects. So hair type, just briefly, there's a lot of talk about slick coats and how good that is in terms of heat dissipation from the animals, and that's true. We've got no doubt about that. So it's very useful for heat dissipation. But of course, the flip side to that is that if you go from really warm conditions to cold, wet conditions, then their ability to maintain body temperature is also reduced. So I guess in some ways it's a double-edged sword if you're in an environment that can switch from very hot conditions to cool conditions in a relatively short period of time. Solar radiation, just looking at ground temperature and just for information, we made measurements on the surface temperature of the ground. So no shade is 56.7. Under shade, it was 38.4. That's with dry ground, 41.2 and 34.3 when the ground was wet. And grass cover with no shade was about 44.5. So you're looking at about a 10-degree difference between no shade and bare ground versus no shade and 90% grass cover. And that can be quite significant, if you've got calves that are being born into that sort of an environment. Okay, so with that, I will hand back to you, Ange.
Thanks, John. So one thing that we did want to talk a little bit about was the importance of nighttime cooling. So this figure that's on this slide here is the heat load index, and we can talk about that. But that's one of these models that we use to sort of evaluate what's happening from that thermal environment and the impact on animals. So when we talk about nighttime cooling or nighttime temperatures, you yourselves would know that if it's been really hot and you've had an uncomfortable night's sleep, that you can pretty well guarantee that the animals around you have had a hot and uncomfortable night as well. And the importance of this is really that we set animals up with that accumulated or load-bearing onboard of heat that we've sort of alluded to a couple of times before. And as John nicely talked about earlier, we've got the difference between chronic and acute heat events. So what's in the red circles on this particular figure is what we call acute events, or those heat wave events that we tend to talk about. Now, the importance of these is really that we don't see nighttime conditions go back to what we would consider a normal or a baseline temperature. So those animals and ourselves go into the next day with what we refer to as accumulated heat load. John, if you could pop that over to the next slide for me, that'd be great. Thank you. So we know that that's what happens through these acute events, and we go through a period of time where we keep accumulating. So those thermal exchange pathways break down. Often what we've seen in the last couple of years in particular is that these events do have those high humidity periods with them in conjunction with high temperatures as well. So it's sort of like a perfect storm of event. And so what's in this figure here is what we've got is in the blue line, a HLI over, I think this is a 3.5-day heat wave event, but also then modeled the accumulated heat load. So there's a model out there that we can estimate what's happening in the green line. And then the red dotted line in that figure there is actually rumen temperature or internal body temperature from some unshaded Angus steers. So what you can see quite nicely there is that the HLI went through a high period of time, which is a classic heat wave event for us. And we expected that accumulated load to keep amping up. And you can see on the first sort of 12 to 24 hour or 12-ish hours at the front end of this heat wave event, those animals have a small period of time of recovery time that may have allowed their body temperatures to come back to normal. If you have a look at the red line that sits there as well, they kind of largely did. But if you have a look at the back end of that heat wave event where that green line doesn't come back to the bottom out on the zero on the x-axis, you can also see that the body temperatures of those animals are starting to creep up fairly well as well. And this is what is really a risk period for us in terms of livestock mortalities. So we start to get into a period of time where we've taken on much more heat from the environment than we can cope with. And all of our mechanisms and our levers that we can pull aren't working. And so we just keep accumulating heat from that environment. What's happening here is that we still have a lot of questions in this space, and there's a lot of questions around what is the threshold that we need to get under at night time to return to those baseline conditions. At the moment, our best guesstimate is somewhere between 6 and 8 hours below 23 degrees. But of course, if we go into nighttime conditions with high humidity, that might actually come down a little bit. Or if it's really low humidity with good wind speeds, that threshold might go up a little bit. So there's still a little bit of work to be done in that area in terms of understanding what nighttime conditions are perfect to go through a reset mechanism. But this is fairly classical style data that we see when we go through those significant sort of heat wave events. And this is a bit of a prelude into what Tim's going to talk to us about. He's going to go a little bit more into the intricacies of accumulated heat load and some of the models, and then into the cold stress stuff. So I'll pass over to Tim now.
I'll just stop sharing.
Thank you.
I stopped?
Thanks, Ange. I'll just share my screen. So hopefully you can see that okay. Yeah, so I'm going to discuss these accumulated heat load events, but probably more from the meteorological perspective, given I'm embedded into the Bureau of Meteorology and I'm not a cattle expert. But I'm going to talk about why the accumulation of heat load is important and something that you should really consider. So just to give a recap of what heat load really is and how we measure it. So as John and Ange nicely pointed out in their talks, it's really this combination of the ambient air temperature, solar radiation, wind speed, and relative humidity. And when you combine all these factors together, you come out with what they call a heat load index, and that's what Ange introduced just prior. And this was developed by John and his team back in the late 2000s. And this is a really nice index which describes how much heat an animal will be accumulating over time. But yeah, well, what happens when, say, nighttime temperatures, say, remain quite high? What happens during a really long heat wave event? I mean, the heat load index is really good at sort of measuring that diurnal cycle of heat, but we want to know more about whether an animal is accumulating heat or dissipating heat during the nighttime. And as John was talking about, there's a lot of differences in breeds of cattle, obviously. And is there a way that we can incorporate this into understanding how certain breeds maybe accumulate heat at a different rate than other breeds. So I'm going to, in a lot of my talks, I always bring it back to cricket. I don't know why. I'm a bit of a cricket tragic, but I want to sort of use an example of an actual event which occurred back in January of 2024 in southern Queensland and northern New South Wales. And this was back when Australia were playing West Indies at the Gabba in Brisbane, and it was really incredibly hot, almost too hot for cricket. And it was actually one of these day-night test matches. And you can see on the right-hand side here on the 27th of January, when they started playing around about 3 p.m, it was about 34.1 degrees in Brisbane, but the feel-like temperature was up around 39 degrees. So it obviously affected the players, but you can imagine what a sort of effect this would have on cattle, particularly cattle in feedlots. And from this event, what we found out was that yes, this weather event, this heat wave event over that long weekend in January, did lead to cattle deaths, particularly in the feedlots. So some yards lost between 20 to 50 cattle. So this is this area of southern Queensland here, and it extended into northern New South Wales. So this was quite a warm, high humid heat wave event, and I'll just go through it now and use the weather conditions and show what impact that had on the heat load and then the accumulated heat load. So I'm going to be using Dalby as an example. So Dalby's in the southern part of Queensland there. And what I'm showing you here is just a time series of the temperature. This is hourly temperature from the 20th of January 2024 all the way through to the end of January. I'm just indicating here where this heat wave event occurred. So this is on this Australia Day long weekend. So you can see how the temperature is going up and down throughout the day and night. So this is this diurnal cycle of temperature. But you can see during this heat wave event, the nighttime temperatures. So this is where it's dipping down. You can see how it's staying relatively warm. So around the mid to low 20 degrees compared to just prior to the heat wave event, you're seeing temperatures dropping below 20. So I can overlay that now with what we call an apparent temperature. So this is what we call the feel-like temperature for humans. So this incorporates the relative humidity and the wind speed. And this is the way that the Bureau measures what we call this feels-like temperature. And you can see that in the red line, you can see that the feel-like temperature for humans is slightly higher during this heat wave event, but also over the nighttime. So you can see it's probably 2 to 3 degrees warmer than the actual measured temperature. And we can also throw in what we call the cattle comfort index. So this is another way of measuring almost like a feel-like temperature for cattle. And I'm not going to be discussing this today, but it's essentially like a feels-like temperature for cattle. And again, this incorporates solar radiation, wind speed, and relative humidity. And you can see, again, these temperatures are slightly higher, particularly during this heat wave event, and even prior to the heat wave event on the 20th, 21st of January. So we can measure this event using the heat load index. So taking all those components, solar load, wind speed, relative humidity, and applying that to the ambient temperature, and you get this heat load index. You can see that it's sort of hovering around the sort of high 90s, but that's fairly meaningless unless you know what thresholds are for cattle, or particular cattle that you're currently running. So John and his team came up with thresholds for cattle, and they used a reference animal, which was Angus steer, and they came up with this value of 86. So 86, anything above 86 is where that animal will start accumulating heat. And then they're using feedlot data. They came up with a value for when an animal will start to dissipate heat. So this is this 77. So anything below 77, your animal will lose heat, and anything above 86, if it's say an Angus breed cattle, it will start accumulating heat above 86. And anything in between is what we call this the thermoneutral zone. So let's use this example and see what happens to the heat load. So you can just look at all the times that it's above 86 and any time it's below 77, and that's essentially your heat accumulation and heat dissipation. And so anything above 77, anything above 86, the animals will start to accumulate heat. You can see that there's a fair amount of time in that early part of that heat wave event, in the sort of 20th to the 23rd January, where the cattle were accumulating heat, but they were losing heat at night as well. And as you move into the heat stress event, you can see again, there are periods sort of up to a day at a time where cattle are accumulating heat, but they're not spending as much time in that sort of heat loss zone. So when we look at what effect this has on the accumulated heat, you can see that early part of January, these cattle are accumulating heat, losing heat, accumulating heat, losing heat, but it's slowly, gradually building up over time until you had this period of sort of lower temperatures and periods where the heat load index was below 77. And then, as Andrew was saying, you get this sort of reset in the heat load. Then during the heat stress event over the Australia Day weekend, they start building up heat. And then you can sort of measure how much time the cattle were spending above certain thresholds. And you can see that if we say that anything above a accumulated heat load unit 50 is considered high, you can see that during this heat stress event, there was an extended period where cattle were in quite severe heat stress, not reaching the severe heat stress level, but noting that that was coming on the back of this other heat event earlier, sort of a week prior. So this is using an accumulated heat load threshold for an Angus steer. So what happens though if you're looking at running, say, Wagyu, Santa Gertrudis, or Brahman breeds of cattle? So we can make adjustments to this upper threshold. So just say if you're running Wagyu, depending on what the color of their coat is, you can raise that upper threshold of heat load, say by 3 units. If you're running a more sort of heat tolerant breed like Santa Gertrudis, again you can increase that upper threshold to a higher level. And then likewise for Brahman, you're adding an extra, say, 10 units to that upper threshold. But you can also reduce that upper threshold depending on whether your cattle, say, are acclimatized to the heat. So if they're not acclimatized to the heat, say if they're brought up from, say, Tasmania all the way to northern Queensland in a very short period of time, they wouldn't be acclimatized to the heat and humidity. Therefore, you lower that upper threshold at which they gain heat. And likewise for sick or diseased animals. So just to give you an example of how you can determine your upper threshold for a Bos Indicus breed, just say it's Bos Indicus, so you'd add 10 to that base heat load index threshold. If they have a white coat, you'd add another 3. If they're acclimatized, that's fine. You don't add anything. Plenty of shade, then you add another 5, say. And if they're healthy, then you don't adjust this at all. And that leads to an upper threshold for this particular example of a cattle. Healthy, white coat, plenty of shade, their upper threshold at which they start to accumulate heat is much higher than, say, the 86. If you have the same breed, but this time they're not acclimatized, they're acclimatized, but they're in a sort of open area, no shade, and they're in fairly poor health, then you would start to reduce that upper threshold at which they would start to gain heat. So the reason we would use accumulated heat load as opposed to other ways of measuring heat stress, it provides a better indication of what's happening on the ground in terms of acute and chronic heat stress. So we've seen examples in the past, say in 1991, when there was a heat stress event in Texas, Queensland, so in the southern part of Queensland, where if you looked at an event in the year of 1991, early February, and used the temperature humidity index, it would give an indication that conditions would have been pretty good. But if you look at that same event using heat load and accumulated heat load, then the values you start to see are more consistent with the impacts on the ground. So we know during that event, thousands of cattle died. And it provides the heat load provides more information about the condition of an animal at any given time. So you know that if an animal's been in a paddock for a number of weeks and it's been quite hot, then it gives you a better indication of what heat load it's actually carrying. And it accounts for this lack of nighttime relief in temperatures. So I'm just going to keep moving on to the next part of this and it's sort of switching tack now, going from hyperthermia, so that increase in heat load, to hypothermia, so understanding what conditions increase the risk of chill in cattle. Use the example here of an event which occurred in 2018 to 2019. So 2018, if you remember that period, it was sort of record-breaking temperatures across northern Australia. Queensland was incredibly hot. The Northern Territory was incredibly hot as well. And these were sort of months of extremely hot temperatures. And cattle in the sort of Gulf region of Australia were showing signs of heat stress. And then there was this monsoon depression which appeared, which sort of developed and moved inland from the Coral Sea, which brought extreme flooding and really extreme temperatures relative to that time of year. So we saw temperatures 12 degrees and below, and really strong winds that persisted for at least a week to 10 days. If we look at this one event using a metric that's typically used for sheep in southern regions of Australia, we find that for this particular event, the heat loss was equivalent to something which was on the high to very high to severe level for southern sheep. So you can imagine that cattle and sheep in the northern parts of Australia are dealing with extreme conditions for a week to 10 days. It's no wonder that they experience such high losses in excess of 500,000 head of cattle and sheep. So these chill events, they actually have become probably more common in the past 10 or so years. And we've seen these on the back of really big weather events like monsoon depressions or tropical cyclones, or even tropical cyclones that weaken but then seemingly stall in one location and then provide those conditions that extend beyond, say, a few days, which are really quite devastating for cattle. So I'm just showing you here that the chill events in Northern Australia can sort of happen in a number of different sort of synoptic setups. If it's sort of like a winter setup, what we tend to see is that in the northern parts of Australia, they're typically associated with like an upper level trough, or what we call a northwest cloud band. And you can sometimes see these high pressure systems that sit over the southern parts of Australia in say the Bight, and this directs this cold airflow, which feeds into these troughs in the north, and usually provides unseasonal rainfall, which then sort of leads to these high chill conditions. And the other way that these events can occur is through what I said before. So these really extreme weather events like monsoon depressions or tropical cyclones, as we saw in February 2019. And as I said, that they typically are slow moving, and that's where you see the devastation. So if they're quick and they move off in say a 1 or 2 days, then yes, you still get extreme conditions, but you don't tend to find those sort of protracted impacts. I'm going to actually skip through this and get to what makes chill events more extreme. So what we noticed in the 2018, in the lead up to the 2019 monsoon depression, which caused flooding and large loss of cattle in the Gulf country, was that this turn in conditions, relatively quick turn in conditions, what we call weather or climate whiplash. So it's where the weather and the climate switches really quickly from something where it's been, say, relatively hot and dry over an extended period to quite cold, wet, windy. And it's those rapid changes which catch animals off guard. And obviously, heavy rainfall makes conditions much more extreme during these chill events. And as John was talking about, animals stuck in quagmires, in mud, they will lose heat more quickly than animals that are in sort of shelter and in drier conditions. And chill events are actually just harder to prepare for because the lead time is usually quite small. So you typically only got less than a week before a week in terms of the lead time and the forecasts. So if you're running cattle on quite a large property, it makes it very difficult to do anything, implement any sort of major decisions about moving cattle long distances if you've only got 1 or 2 days to implement that. And then finally, how do we reduce the impact of chill? This is just really briefly. Then we'll cover this probably more in the second and third webinars in the next couple of weeks. But obviously, shelter, moving cattle into shelter, if you can, it makes sense. Increasing that windbreak, exposing cattle to dry conditions, so reducing the conduction of heat or reducing that heat loss. Supplying feed is an important one. So typically energy requirements for cattle during cold weather events will go up by 20%. So increasing the feed if you're able to is one way to reduce that impact. And obviously making sure you monitor the situation, monitor lighter weight cattle. So cattle that are either quite young or sick, they will be obviously more susceptible to chill. And then this leads me into just keeping an eye on the forecasts. And I will now move on to where to source forecast information for both chill and heat stress events. So just bear with me a second. Hopefully, can you still see my screen okay, Vicky? Fantastic. So I will show you.
I was just going to quickly interrupt there, Tim. The links that you would have received in the PDF today, if you follow along there, you'll be on your screen, you'll be able to follow along with Tim. Go ahead, Tim.
No worries. Thanks, Vicky. So we have developed a thermal stress page on our Northern Australian Climate Program website. So if you just go to nacp.org.au and then go up to products and you go down to cattle thermal stress forecasts, hopefully this will work. It didn't work this morning, but it's working now. And it will come up with a whole bunch of these indices, these forecasts. Now, these are all gridded forecasts like what you'd see in the Bureau's webpage, but they're all specific for cattle or sheep. And the one that we're interested in for heat load is obviously the heat load index. And what these are showing are hourly conditions for heat load out to the next sort of 9 or so days. So you can see that this is today's date, Tuesday, 29th of July. And this is at 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. And this is from a forecast from earlier in the morning. So this is from the Bureau's deterministic forecast model. So as a user, you can go through, you can click through, you can play the forecast automatically, and it'll just show you what the conditions are across the country for the next 9 to 7 days. But just noting that these are at hourly intervals. So if you start off, this is what the conditions will be at 10 a.m. Queensland time this morning, and then it moves forward in 3-hourly intervals. So that's the heat load index forecast. But if you're interested in what's happening with the accumulated heat load, then you can click on that metric, and then you can choose your breed of cattle. We have, at the moment, we've got 5 different, I won't say breeds, but 5 different thresholds available for users. So just say you're interested in what's happening for Brahman and Angus, you can click on that, and that will take you to the forecasts of the accumulated heat load over time. Given it is in the middle of winter in the south and dry season up north, you'll find that these maps don't look overly impressive. But as you can see, as you go through the forecast, you'll see the heat building up, dissipating, building up, and dissipating. And as we get closer to the build up to the wet season, you'll see these maps. You'll see the heat starting to build, particularly up in the northern tropics. And if you're after more information about accumulated heat load there, it's all in that page. So check it out, have a bit of a play around. And the most important thing is if you've got any feedback to us, how we can improve these, let us know. One thing we did introduce was statewide forecast, which we're still updating. So for Queensland, if you're interested in what's going on in your local region, you can do that. That's available. And I'll hand over to Vicky now to quickly go through the Med-Eye forecast at the Bureau of Meteorology. Thanks, Vicky.
Thanks so much, Tim. I'll just share my screen here for everyone. So on the Bureau of Meteorology's, well, I think I've got the wrong screen sharing here. Tim, can you see the Bureau's screen share there?
You're all good, Vicky.
Fantastic. So on the Bureau of Meteorology's homepage, Met-Eye, you'll see here just to the right of the Australian map. You click on Met-Eye, and what Met-Eye is it's a 7-day forecast over 3-hourly intervals. Now, a little tip here for you is up here in the search bar, type in a postcode. So just say, for example, if I just typed in chinchilla, it would only bring me up chinchilla. But if I type in the postcode, then I can go in and have a look at what's happening for home, and it zooms right in there. And this is very, very similar to what you will actually see on the Bureau of Meteorology's app. Now, where I find Med-Eye very useful, because you've actually got to go through and click and adjust up to get your temperature and your humidity, is up in the top right-hand corner, you actually click on Text View. When you do that, you'll see there that it takes you to another screen. If we turn around and we have to type back in our location, unfortunately, so I'll just bring back up Burncleuth there. Just bear in mind that these forecasts are based on the nearest centre, and it will tell us there, and that's actually miles for chinchilla. So if you're out at, say, Blackall, it may likely be Longreach, or it could even be back Roma. You just need to investigate a little bit more onto that. But where I find this very useful, if you actually come over and have a look at the detailed 3-hourly forecast, you can see then the next 7 days, and it brings you up that wind speed, the humidity, as well as your temperature. Where it's really handy is you can go and cut and paste these into a Word document. When you're planning for the next 7 days, you might be planning your mustering, you might be planning branding, you might be planning weaning or trucking. You can actually sit down and go through this and go, righto, well, look, things aren't looking too crash hot, especially if we're looking at heat load events and accumulated heat load. And you may actually adjust your schedule if there's wiggle room. But at the field days, we'll actually go through this in a lot more details. So if you need any help in utilising the Med-Eye site or any of the products that are on our NACPI website, please reach out to us. And part of our Climate Mate Extension program is we funded by Meat and Livestock Australia and the Drought and Climate Adaptation program, and we're able to sit down and go through how to actually interpret those forecasts, how to utilise all these tools and products at no expense to you. We can do it via Teams, or if we're in the area, we can come and sit down. We love having a cuppa and sitting down at the kitchen table with you. I really want to thank today all our expert panel, Dr. Tim Cowan, Dr. Angela Lees, Professor John Goggin. You would see Kieran's been with us all day today, but he will be presenting in the next webinar. And we've also had Ali Murray, who's the Innovation Node Manager for Longreach and Roma, has been just keeping an eye on the chat and helping us in the background. So thank you very much, Ali. In the next webinar, we're going to be covering off, I've just made a boo-boo here, but we're going a lot more into detail on those production impacts on production and how both the heat stress and chill could be impacting those different levels of production. Then in webinar 3, we're really honing down into that genetics component and what things are looking like in the future. Please, I encourage you to complete the survey that you'll receive. You'll receive an email tomorrow with a recording of this webinar and the survey. And I hope we see you all again next Tuesday, sorry, next Tuesday, 12 noon. And I really do hope you've gotten a lot out of today. We're just going to start building those stepping stones towards that better understanding. Thanks very much, team.